For quite some time, the left and the right have been at odds with each other in terms of freedom of speech, what it really means, and how unlimited freedom of speech truly is. The purpose of freedom of speech has always been, and will always be, the ability and the freedom to freely express ideas and concepts freely without suppression. On April 12, 1633, the Catholic Church began their inquisitions of Galileo Galilei. Galileo was ordered to turn himself into the Holy Office to begin trial for holding belief that the earth revolves around the sun. He was subsequently convicted of heresy, sentenced to life imprisonment, and was eventually put under house arrest pending his health conditions, along with having his writings prohibited. This is one of the most crucial events in history that is used so often to illustrate just how toxic censorship can be. Thankfully, in the Western world and society, we don't experience censorship of the likes of this anymore. What freedom of speech is by today's standards is the ability to freely express yourself without legal punishment. In Ireland, this is based on Article 40.6.1 of the Irish Constitution, whereas in the United States it's based on the First Amendment of the US Constitution. With that all said, freedom of speech is not absolute. Many people assume that freedom of speech means anything goes. Well, it doesn't. You can't use freedom of speech if it involves any form of defamation, be it libel or slander. It doesn't permit you to threaten the lives of others or put other individuals into dangerous situations. You also can't use freedom of speech to justify illegal activity. This includes, but it is not limited to, justifying child abuse, blackmail, perjury, etc. So for example, I'm sure many of you who are active in the YouTube community all recall Shane Dawson's racy pedophile joke. Well, that's not protected under free speech. Back in 2010, a self-published book was placed on Amazon. The book in question was basically a how-to guide for pedophiles. And that author in question most certainly was not protected under the right of freedom of speech. Naturally enough, the author was arrested and charged for obscenity. Based on what many news outlets had reported regarding this book, it promoted dangerous and violent abuse towards minors. It even went into specific details on how to manipulate minors in many different ways. If we are to entertain a anything goes policy in terms of freedom of speech, then depraved literature like this and those who create them are justified by the tip of a hat. What all of these instances I've just mentioned illustrate is that while freedom of speech is certainly very important and it certainly has its place, but at the same time ought to have some sort of boundaries, especially when it comes to promoting ideologies that can be very harmful to others. Now, when it comes to social networks such as Facebook and Twitter, there's been a lot of divisions of different opinions of what these companies should or should not be allowed to do. When you sign up to any mainstream website, there are naturally enough going to be a set of rules, a set of guidelines, a set of community guidelines that you need to follow. This much is simple. Facebook and Twitter have collectively received a fair bit of criticism in regards to the lack of clarity on what exactly its policies are, what they mean, what they entail. But to their credit, they have, from what I can see and in my opinion, taken that feedback on board. They have updated their policies, or rather restated their policies, to make it very, very clear on what their position is on harmful and hateful content. On Twitter, they have a very well laid out policy that they call the hateful conduct policy. Whereas over on Facebook, they have a very clearly defined hate speech policy. Both social networks define what they mean by their terms. They define the harm that is caused by promoting and posting hateful content. They affirm that this type of behavior will not be tolerated, and they explain the consequences of breaching these rules. The most important thing to acknowledge here is that we do still have freedom of speech, and most social networks will do their very best to accommodate us so that we can freely express ourselves as much as possible. But freedom of speech does not mean that you have the freedom to a platform or the entitlement to a platform, or that you are free from consequences. When we sign up to Facebook, to Twitter, to Google, to many mainstream major websites, we were all given a set of rules. We were informed of what those rules were, and we were informed of what the consequences are going to be if we refuse to follow them. If any main social network were to allow an anything goes freedom of speech policy, there would be disastrous consequences. They would have a bigger problem with trolling, with spam, with cyberbullying. And cyberbullying, for example, has led to all sorts of disastrous consequences. And if you don't believe me, simply just Google Amanda Todd. Social network businesses need these policies, and their users need these policies. It is by no means a perfect system, and there's always going to be users who slip through the cracks and break the rules, but they have to at least try to keep their users safe by having these provisions in place. And even if you do find yourself banned from Facebook, Twitter, or even YouTube, that does not in any way prevent you from having freedom of speech. You can still find an alternative public space to hold these views. After all, Facebook and Twitter, they don't owe you a platform. They are, after all, let's not forget, a free service. However, the flip side of this conversation is when we do have actual occurrences of violations of freedom of speech. Not so long ago in Ireland, we had a blasphemy law, a law that stated that you could be fined a large sum of money for publicly making offensive statements that have offended a large group of people. Thankfully, we have had the good sense to scrap the blasphemy law. However, there are many countries who have not scrapped their blasphemy laws. And a lot of these countries have much harsher punishments than a steep fine. In many Muslim majority countries, blasphemy is punishable under Sharia law by the punishment of death. Some of those countries include Pakistan, Saudi Arabia, and Yemen. Punishing a person for stating an opinion on a religious text or a piece of philosophy is the very type of censorship and violation of freedom of speech that we should be fighting against. Especially when it comes to a person receiving the death penalty for simply speaking their own thoughts. And even if the punishment isn't the death penalty, it could be the punishment of receiving 100 lashes, it could be the punishment of spending many years in prison, or maybe it could simply be receiving a fine. Any punishment, great or small, as a consequence of speaking one's mind in regards to a religious, a philosophical, or even a political matter, should never be accepted. And even if the blasphemy laws are not extreme enough in terms of censorship, let's not forget the gay propaganda laws in Russia. Since the enactment of this law, it has put even further marginalization on LGBTQ Russians. Websites have been shut down that provide information to LGBTQ youth in Russia. Teachers are not permitted to speak of LGBTQ issues in a positive light. It is a law that not only limits freedom of speech, it limits the accessing of factual information. It is another means to allow conservatives in Russia justify their bigotry and their discrimination and their hatred towards LGBTQ Russians. These are the types of attacks on freedom of speech we should be fighting against. It doesn't matter if you don't live in a country that has a blasphemy law or has propaganda laws. These attacks on expression of thought are an injustice no matter where they happen. And while we fight against and oppose these forms of oppression and attack on freedom of speech, we also need to understand the importance of the previously stated provisions that we have here in the West in regards to our freedom of speech. Those provisions, supported by social networks and many private companies, are not designed to oppress you, but to keep others safe. Yes, our opinions are important, our right to state them is important, but not so important that we justify sending out the mob troops to unleash personal attacks on vulnerable individuals, to then push them over the edge, make them feel so low, so insignificant that the value of their life to them means so little that they may as well not be alive at all. We should be seeking ways to minimize suicides, not increase them. And so everyone, that is where I pass this topic on to you. What are your views on freedom of speech? Do you support an anything goes policy, or like me, do you think that there should be some sort of provisions in the interest of keeping others safe? Let me know in the comments down below, or feel free to post a video response and include the video response tag listed down below in the description area. And until next time everyone, freedom, peace and love.